Hi, this is the Bible Touchstone. In my last video, I was giving a little bit of my response to the new edition of the book, Beyond Creation Science, and it's the new hot topic in modern preterism. And I didn't show very much approval of it in my first video. And one of the reasons is because I think that the hermeneutical approach and system that is implied therein, I think that there's a more apparent model to interpret Scripture rather than just, as my friend put it, being consistent. Whereas if we see in Revelation a metaphor like heaven and earth, if we find a metaphor in Revelation does not necessarily infer that every time we see in Scripture heaven and earth that it's always a metaphor. I mentioned PARDS, or P-A-R-D-E-S, which is the hermeneutical tradition of Torah. And even in Genesis, we see a metaphorical application of darash, as heaven and earth are used in the Old Testament and Torah as subpoenaed witnesses of the Deuteronomic covenant between God and his people. We also see an example of remez in Galatians chapter 4, which refers to Genesis, of the two covenants, one after Sarah and one after Hagar. And also, the Sud is the Christ in the Scriptures. But the Peshat, or the plain, literal central theme that we see in any given passage, the immediate context, that doesn't necessarily, basically everything is established upon that. So if we see heaven and earth created in a literal sense in Genesis, then the metaphorical application we see in Deuteronomy and Isaiah and the Psalms and Ecclesiastes, that metaphor, that's established upon a literal Peshat of Genesis. So the metaphor, or like let's say darash, that can never contradict Peshat because there's always one central theme, and the Torah or the Torah hermeneutic system is not based on contradictions or opposite meanings. Now, I told my friend that I thought he was implying that the plain meaning is subject to the metaphorical applications of that literal central theme, and that's why I called that hermeneutic system, or that model, liberal. It is hermeneutical, but it's not conservative hermeneutics. I think that also it could lend to subjectivism and relativism, and the metaphor is established by the literal meaning as a practical application to it, and not the other way around. So the call to consistency, I think, is rather weak because it does more to delegitimize the metaphorical approach than to compromise the plain meaning of Genesis chapters 1 and 2. That is, because I interpret 1,000 years in Revelation as figurative, that doesn't mean that I all of a sudden use all other time statements in the Bible as figurative. And we all know, at least preterists know, that when Revelation says, things which must shortly come to pass, we don't call for this sort of consistency and liberalize every time statement because that would be exegetically unwarranted by the given immediate context. So granted, Genesis chapters 1 and 2 is not a science book, and there are actually perhaps two creation accounts in Genesis 1 and 2, but we've got to take care in our interpretation and respect the genre boundaries of it. And some of that's lost when we read it in English. We don't get the poetry, and when we see it out of context, we don't see the covenantal framework of Genesis. So, granted, Revelation may allude to conventions in Genesis, and they both testify of Christ, but if we see an application or a metaphor in somewhere else in the Bible, it doesn't mean that every time we see that vocab word that we just haphazardly and arbitrarily just apply that everywhere. In my next video, I'm going to give an explanation or a justification of the PARD system and show that it is definitely necessary in interpreting Scripture. And we're going to be talking about Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. So stay tuned to my next video. As always, grace be to you.